I suppose I always knew deep down that it would end like this, that someday I'd find out the truth not through a conversation, but through an accident, a stray text, an unguarded moment. The universe has a way of revealing what you try not to see. It was a Saturday morning, and the sun was coming through my kitchen window in that soft, golden way that makes you almost forget your heart can still be broken at 68. I was stirring cream into my coffee when my phone buzzed. At first, I thought it was one of the appointment reminders I get, or maybe a sale at the garden centre. But when I tapped the screen, I saw my niece's name. There was no message, just a photo attachment. I remember holding my breath without realizing it. I swiped to open the picture, and there they were, all of them. My brother, my sister-in-law, their children, my other niece with her husband. Even the babies, perched on their laps like little porcelain dolls. All smiling in front of a big blue banner that read, "Family Reunion, Love Always Wins, Love Always Wins." The words felt like an echo in an empty room. I studied every face, as if maybe I'd find some explanation written in their eyes. But there was nothing. Just rows of smiles and matching t-shirts. No space carved out for me. No empty chair waiting. I set the phone down on the table as gently as if it were made of glass. I don't remember sitting, but I must have, because when I looked around, I was in the chair by the window, staring out at the yard. The hydrangeas were starting to fade, edges curling brown. It struck me as fitting, how something can look so beautiful from a distance and still be dying at the edges. I thought about the checks I'd written, the bills I'd paid, how many times over the years I'd offered to help when someone was in a bind. When my brother's hours got cut at work, I covered their mortgage for 3 months. When my niece needed a down payment for her first car, I'd sent the money the same afternoon. I never asked for repayment, never held it over their heads. I told myself it was what family did. But apparently family didn't include me. Not when there were photos to be taken, memories to be made. I kept thinking maybe it was an oversight. Maybe someone had sent me an invitation that got lost in the mail. Maybe they'd called and I'd missed it. But the more I replayed all the weeks leading up to that morning, the more certain I became that no one had even thought of me. Not even for a moment. After a while, my phone buzzed again. I didn't look. I just sat there, breathing carefully, the way you do when you know that if you let out even one sob, you might never stop. My chest felt tight, like there was a hand pressing down, reminding me I wasn't as indispensable as I'd believed. I wish I could say it was the first time I'd felt this way. But the truth is, I'd spent my entire life in the role of the quiet supporter, the dependable aunt, the helpful sister, the one you called when your checking account dipped too low, or when your kids needed a little extra for summer camp. It had become so familiar I hardly noticed the cost of it. How small it made me feel when the thank yous grew shorter and the expectations larger. When my own milestones went unnoticed. When my husband Carl died 7 years ago, I remember standing in our living room during the wake and realizing no one was really looking at me. They were talking around me about funeral details and who would take home the leftover casseroles. I was a prop in my own grief. Today felt no different, except this time there was no Carl to squeeze my hand, just me, and this heavy knowing that I'd let them believe I didn't need to be loved the way I loved them. I reached for the phone again. My hands were trembling. I finally opened the message that had followed the photo. It was a single line from my niece. "Hope you're well. Aunt Linda, we missed you." I read it twice, maybe 3 times. The words were so light, they might as well have been air. Nothing in them hinted at regret or apology, just a breezy acknowledgement, like I was the afterthought, the distant relative you feel obligated to mention. That was when something in me shifted. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't call anyone to demand an explanation. Instead, I set the phone down again and stared out at the yard until the sun shifted and the shadows lengthened across the grass. My coffee had gone cold, but I didn't care. In that quiet, I knew the truth. I had spent a lifetime involving myself in their problems, and they had never once thought to involve me in their joy. And for the first time, I wondered, what would it look like if I stopped trying to earn my place in a family that didn't see me? I didn't move from that chair for a long time. It's strange how still you can become when your heart feels like it's unspooling. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the clock over the stove. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do next. Eventually, my body reminded me I was still alive, still tethered to this world by hunger and habit. I stood, my knees aching more than usual, and poured the cold coffee down the sink. I rinsed the cup, set it in the drying rack, and wiped the counter with the same careful strokes I'd used for decades, keeping things tidy, making sure everything was in its place. I suppose that was the theme of my life, making things easier for everyone else, smoothing over the mess, quietly stepping aside so others could feel comfortable. From the time I was a little girl, I'd learned that love was something you earned by being useful. When I was 8, my mother fell into one of her spells. That's what we called them, spells. Days when she'd retreat to her bedroom and not come out. My father would clatter around the kitchen, cursing under his breath because there was no dinner waiting. And so, I'd climb up onto the counter, pull down a can of soup, and heat it on the stove. I'd set the table for my brothers, making sure everyone had a spoon and a glass of milk. No one ever thanked me, but I did it anyway, because if I didn't, the house felt like it might collapse. That was how it started, I think. This idea that my worth was measured in what I could do for other people. It followed me into adulthood, into my marriage, into every friendship and holiday gathering. Even when I had nothing left to give, I found a way to scrape up a little more. I used to think it was noble, this capacity to absorb everyone's burdens. But sitting there that morning, with the image of their smiling faces still burned behind my eyes, it struck me how small it had made me, how invisible. I walked to my desk and pulled out the folder where I kept all the bills and account information. My handwriting, neat and precise, filled dozens of pages, passwords, policy numbers, account balances. I'd organized everything so if anyone needed help, I could offer it quickly. The gas bill for my brother's house, which I'd been paying since last winter when he said things were a little tight. The phone plan I'd added my niece to when she was between jobs. The insurance premium for my sister-in-law's car. All of it, under my name. At the time, it had felt like love. Now it felt like a ledger of my own erasure. I sat down and traced my finger over the first bill. It felt absurd that so much of my life, my energy, my security, was tied up in people who couldn't be bothered to invite me to a picnic. My throat tightened, but instead of tears, I felt a slow, simmering clarity rise in me. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was grief finally settling into a shape I could recognize. But in that moment, I understood something simple and devastating. I was not indispensable. I was convenient, and convenience has a way of becoming entitlement. I closed the folder and pressed it to my chest. My heart thumped steady beneath it, and for the first time in years, I listened to it. really listened. What it was telling me was quiet but undeniable. I didn't have to keep buying my place in their lives. The thought made me dizzy. For so long, I'd believed that cutting the cord would make me cruel, that setting boundaries meant I didn't care. But sitting there, I realized it was the opposite. The only person I'd been unkind to was myself. I looked around my little house, the photos of Carl on the mantel, the quilt draped over the back of the couch, the small vase of daisies I'd picked from the yard. All these gentle, simple things that were mine alone. They felt more real to me in that moment than any family reunion banner ever could. I set the folder down and took a deep breath. My hands were steadier now. I knew there would be phone calls, accusations, maybe even tears. But I also knew I couldn't keep living the same story. I had been a supporting character in everyone else's life for too long. It was time to be the main character in mine. That afternoon, I made myself a cup of tea and set the folder on the kitchen table. I watched the steam curl up from my mug and thought about how many years I'd spent trying to make sure everyone else was comfortable. How many times I'd told myself it was enough to be needed, even if I wasn't wanted. I reached for the first document in the stack, the utility bill for my brother's house. I remembered the night he called me last winter, his voice thick with shame as he explained how the furnace had stopped working, how he didn't know how he'd keep the kids warm. My heart had broken for him. Of course I'd stepped in. Of course I'd said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." And I had. I logged into the account, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. A small voice in me wavered. Was I really going to do this? Was I really going to stop being the person they could rely on? But another voice, steadier and older, answered without hesitation. Yes. Because the truth was, I had become their safety net. And in doing so, I'd let them believe I didn't need anything in return. No gratitude, no inclusion, no consideration. Just an endless stream of needs I would quietly meet. I took a sip of tea, the heat of it grounding me, and navigated to the settings page. There was a checkbox labeled Remove Payment Method. My hand didn't shake as I clicked it. One by one, the charges I'd been covering disappeared from my list. I moved on to the phone plan. My niece had needed a new line when she lost her job, and I'd added her to my account without a second thought. She'd promised she'd take over the payments as soon as she could. That was 3 years ago. The payment had never switched to her name. I pulled up the account details. My eyes rested on her phone number, the same one she'd used to send me that photo of the reunion. I wondered if she'd think to call when her service stopped working. If she'd feel even a flicker of embarrassment, realizing the person she hadn't bothered to invite was the same person who paid her bills. I felt a pang of guilt, but I didn't let it stop me. I had carried this arrangement for too long, excusing it as generosity. But generosity given without respect becomes obligation, and obligation without gratitude becomes resentment. I cancelled her line. When I was done, I closed the folder and exhaled. The house was so quiet I could hear my heartbeat. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was something gentler and heavier, a kind of sorrowful relief, like setting down a load I'd carried so long I'd forgotten how tired it made me. I knew they would call soon, and I knew exactly what they would say. That I was overreacting, that family helps family, that it wasn't a big deal, that I should have just asked to come along if I felt left out. The excuses would pile up like damp laundry, uncomfortable, sour smelling, impossible to ignore. I poured the rest of my tea down the sink and rinsed the cup. My movements were calm, deliberate. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for the next request. I wasn't anticipating who would need what from me. I was simply here, in my own kitchen, in my own life. When the phone rang, I didn't pick up. I watched the screen light up with my brother's name. I imagined his confusion as the automated email arrived, informing him he was now responsible for his own payments. The part of me that still ached to be liked wanted to explain, to soften the blow. But I didn't, because the truth was, they already knew what they were doing. They knew I would pick up the pieces without complaint. I stood by the window and watched a squirrel dart across the lawn, its tiny body trembling with urgency. For so long I'd lived like that, skittish, reactive, always scrambling to stay useful. But today, I felt something different, a stillness that felt like the beginning of peace. I thought about Carl, how he used to tell me I gave too much of myself away. "You're allowed to have edges, Lynn," he would say. "You don't have to be soft all the time." I never really understood what he meant until now. I pressed my palm flat against the glass, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin. The world outside kept moving, oblivious to my small act of rebellion. But to me, it felt enormous, like I was reclaiming a part of myself I'd lost. In that moment, I knew this was only the beginning. There were more accounts to close, more ties to untangle. But for the first time, I didn't feel afraid. I felt ready, ready to draw the line. It didn't take long for the calls to turn into voicemails. The first few were polite, almost tentative, as if they weren't quite sure whether they were allowed to be angry yet. My brother's voice, carefully measured. "Hey, Linda, I think there's been some sort of mix-up with the utility bill. Could you give me a call when you have a minute? Aunt Linda, I think my phone got shut off by mistake. No big deal. I just wanted to check in with you." I listened to each message, letting the words sink in without responding. For so long, I'd been quick to smooth over these misunderstandings, eager to reassure everyone that of course I was still here to help, that they didn't need to feel bad for relying on me. But now, sitting at my kitchen table with the folder of cancelled accounts beside me, I realized how familiar their voices sounded. Not warm, not remorseful, just expectant. By the third day, the messages had changed. My sister-in-law's voice was brittle with irritation. "Linda, I don't know why you've decided to do this now, but it's really putting us in a bind. We've always appreciated your help, but this is, well, it feels spiteful." Spiteful. I turned the word over in my mind like a pebble in my palm. If setting a boundary felt like spite to them, maybe it was because they'd never seen me do it before. They didn't know any other version of me, but the one who quietly absorbed the inconvenience of others. I was still thinking about that when the doorbell rang. My heart fluttered, a reflex I couldn't control. Part of me still wanted to believe someone had come to apologize, to say they understood. When I opened the door, it was my brother standing there, holding his ball cap in both hands, like a boy sent to the principal's office. He looked tired, older than I remembered. "Linda," he began, his voice gentle in that way it always was when he wanted something. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside to let him in. Some habits die harder than others. He sat at the kitchen table while I poured him a cup of coffee. It struck me that this was the first time in years he'd come by without needing me to babysit or lend him money. Even now, though, the visit had an agenda. "I just don't understand," he said after a sip. "You know we've been going through a rough patch. I thought you were okay helping out." "I was," I said softly, folding my hands in my lap. "For a long time." He looked up, surprised by the evenness in my voice. Maybe he'd expected me to be flustered, to scramble, to justify myself. You could have said something, he pressed. We would have invited you to the reunion. It wasn't meant to hurt you. I studied the lines in his face, so familiar and so strange all at once. This was the brother I'd loaned money to when his first marriage ended. The man I'd sat beside in a hospital waiting room when his son broke his arm. He wasn't a monster, just accustomed to my silence. Maybe it wasn't meant to hurt me, I said, but it did. He shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. Your family, we love you. I nodded slowly. I know, but love shouldn't feel like a transaction. He stared at me, mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. In that moment, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not victory, not vindication, just a release. Linda, you've always been so generous, he said finally, as though generosity was a flaw I needed to apologize for. It's just who you are. It was, I agreed. But I think I've been confusing generosity with obligation. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I don't know what you expect us to do. I expect you to take care of your own bills, I said gently. I expect you to understand that I'm tired. We sat there in silence, the kind that's too heavy to fill. Finally, he stood and set his untouched coffee on the counter. All right, he said, his voice tight. I guess we'll figure it out. I walked him to the door. As he stepped onto the porch, he turned back to look at me. I couldn't read his expression, some mixture of bewilderment and resentment. For a moment, I almost reached out, almost said I was sorry, almost promised to fix it all. But I didn't. I closed the door behind him and leaned my forehead against the wood. My heart was beating hard, but it wasn't fear this time. It was the feeling of my life finally becoming my own. I knew the calls would keep coming, the guilt would echo. But I also knew this was the only way to unlearn the patterns that had kept me small. And for the first time, I felt certain that I could. The days that followed were quiet in the way a storm's aftermath is quiet. Everything hushed and raw, the debris still settling. Each morning I woke before the sun, made a cup of tea and sat with my thoughts. Sometimes I replayed the conversation with my brother, wondering if there was something I could have said to make him understand. Other times, I simply watched the light creep across the floor and felt, in some small corner of my heart, the relief of finally telling the truth. I had always imagined that drawing boundaries would feel harsh, that cutting ties would make me cold or bitter. But instead, it felt like breathing after years of holding my breath. One by one, I began sorting through the tangle of obligations I'd woven around myself. The insurance policies I'd been paying for my sister-in-law, the streaming services I'd added to help the kids feel normal during the pandemic, the grocery delivery subscriptions I'd signed up for when my niece was on bed rest and had simply kept renewing. I made a list of every expense, every favor that had quietly morphed into expectation. The list was longer than I'd anticipated. Seeing it in black and white was sobering. How had I let my life become so entangled with theirs? I sat at my desk with the folder of account information open, a pen in hand. I told myself I'd do this methodically, one cancellation at a time, so no one would be left in the lurch. But as I began calling customer service lines and removing my payment methods, a deeper truth settled over me. No matter how gently I did this, someone would feel abandoned. And maybe that was okay. Maybe it wasn't my job to keep everyone from feeling uncomfortable. It took the better part of the week to unravel it all. Each phone call was a small act of liberation, even when my stomach fluttered with nerves. I explained to each representative that I was no longer responsible for these accounts, that the individuals tied to them would need to assume responsibility going forward. Every time I hung up, I felt lighter. On Thursday morning, I cancelled the last subscription, the monthly grocery delivery. As I confirmed the cancellation, I thought about my niece's face when she'd thanked me the first time. How grateful she'd been then. How quickly that gratitude had faded into assumption. It wasn't her fault alone. I'd trained them all to expect it. I'd made it easy to take me for granted because I was too afraid to be anything other than agreeable. When I closed my laptop, I felt a quiet finality, like closing a chapter I'd been too scared to finish. I walked through the house, noticing for the first time how calm it felt. No buzzing phone, no mental tally of who needed what. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my slippers. Later that afternoon, my niece called. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice was tight, controlled. "Aunt Linda, I don't really understand what's going on," she began. "I'm trying not to be upset, but you've put us in a really hard position. You know we count on you." Count on me. As if I were a service, not a person. When her message ended, I didn't replay it. I simply deleted it and set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. I thought about Carl then, how he used to tease me for apologizing to the cashier if the line was long, or to the doctor if my appointment ran over. "You say sorry like it's punctuation," he'd told me once, smiling. I smiled now, though it hurt a little, because he'd been right. All these years, I'd been sorry for taking up space, sorry for having needs, sorry for wanting more than to be needed. I went to the hall closet and pulled out a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were old photo albums, birthday cards, the letters Carl had written me when he worked out of state. I carried the box to the living room and settled into my armchair. As I turned the pages, I let myself remember the woman I'd been before I became the family's safety net. The woman who used to paint watercolors on Sunday afternoons, who took long drives with no destination, who laughed without worrying whether her joy made someone else uncomfortable. I felt her stirring inside me, as if she'd just been waiting for permission to return. I didn't know exactly what would come next, but for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel trapped in other people's expectations. I felt possible. The next morning, I woke before dawn and watched the pale grey light seep through the curtains. I lay there for a while, feeling the strange stillness of a house no longer tethered to everyone else's demands. My phone was silent on the nightstand. No texts, no voicemails, just silence. For a moment, I worried that maybe I'd gone too far, that maybe this was the price of finally telling the truth, that I would be alone. But then I realized something simpler. I had been alone for years. I'd just been too busy to notice. I slipped out of bed and made tea. As the kettle whistled, I thought about what I might do with all this newfound time and energy. It felt like being given a blank canvas, and the thought both thrilled and frightened me. After breakfast, I pulled out my address book and thumbed through names I hadn't called in ages. Friends I'd drifted from, not because of any falling out, but because my life had become a revolving door of family emergencies. I stopped at Helen's name. We'd taught together decades ago. She'd called me last Christmas, left a message saying she missed me. I'd meant to call back, but life, other people's lives, got in the way. Before I could lose my nerve, I dialed her number. She picked up on the second ring. "Linda," she said, her voice warm and surprised. "Well, I'll be... How long has it been?" We talked for nearly an hour. about nothing and everything, about the way the world felt smaller and stranger as we got older, about her garden, about Carl. She asked how my family was, and I hesitated for only a heartbeat before I told her the truth, that I was stepping back, that it was time to take care of myself. "Oh, Linda," she murmured, her voice gentle. "Good for you." When we hung up, I felt lighter, like someone had laid a hand on my shoulder and said, "You don't have to carry this alone." I made 3 more calls that day. Each conversation was a small reclamation of the parts of myself I'd abandoned. By the afternoon, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years: host a gathering. Not for the family, not out of obligation, just for me. I pulled out the good plates, the ones that had been gathering dust in the cabinet. I made a grocery list: fresh flowers, lemon bars, Helen's favourite, a bottle of wine. It felt almost frivolous, but in the best way. When Saturday came, Helen and 2 other old friends behance sat around my kitchen table, talking and laughing like no time had passed at all. I looked around at their faces and felt a warmth I hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging that asked nothing in return. At one point, Helen reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You look happy," she said simply. I smiled. "I think I am." And in that small, ordinary moment, I realized that love doesn't have to be bought or bargained for. It can be quiet and mutual and freely given. After they left, I stood in the doorway and watched them walk to their cars. The porch light glowed softly behind me, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for someone to tell me who I was. I already knew. A week later, I sat at my desk with the folder of financial records, the one I'd once guarded like a sacred text. Only this time, I wasn't here to pay bills or solve problems. I was here to set one final intention. I opened the envelope that held my will. My lawyer had prepared it years ago, back when Carl was still alive and we had simpler plans. Leave everything to family, because that's what you did. I read over each page, feeling the old assumptions in every line, as if love were a debt to be repaid with every penny I'd saved. But I knew better now. I picked up the pen and made notes in the margins, questions for my lawyer about changing beneficiaries, adjusting the trusts, making sure what I left behind went to the people and causes that had given me something back, no matter how small. When I finished, I felt a calm I hadn't expected. It wasn't vengeance, it wasn't even anger anymore, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing my life, and everything in it, was finally my own. Later that afternoon, my doorbell rang. When I opened it, I was surprised to see my granddaughter standing there, clutching a small canvas tote bag. She looked unsure, her hair pulled into a loose braid. "Hi, Grandma," she said, her voice soft. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside and watched her walk into the living room, her eyes darting around as if expecting disapproval. "I'm sorry," she blurted before she even sat down. "I didn't know you weren't invited. Mum made it sound like you just didn't want to come." I felt a sadness and gratitude all at once. I motioned for her to sit beside me on the couch. "I know, sweetheart," I said gently. "It wasn't your fault." She hesitated, then reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small framed photo, one of her and me at her 5th birthday party, laughing with frosting on our faces.
"I keep this on my dresser," she said, her eyes shining. I wanted you to know you matter to me."
I pressed a hand over my mouth, tears stinging my eyes. In that moment, I felt the years of disappointment soften, not disappear, but loosen their hold. "Thank you," I whispered. We sat together a long while, her head resting on my shoulder. When she left, the house felt quiet, but not empty. That evening, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the sun sink behind the trees. I thought about all the ways I'd tried to earn my place, all the times I'd mistaken obligation for love. And for the first time, I didn't feel I owed anyone anything. I just felt free.